A Love Worth Defending by Evelyn Merrick. The rifle shot cracked through the morning air, followed immediately by the satisfying thunk of lead hitting its target. Maggie O'Brien lowered her Winchester, squinting across the valley at the tin can that now sported a fresh hole through its center. At 24, she could outshoot most men in 3 counties, a skill that had kept her family's ranch running since her father's death 2 winters past. "Show off," came a familiar voice behind her, tinged with grudging admiration. Maggie turned to find Sheriff Luke Garrison dismounting from his bay gelding, his badge catching the early light. Even after 6 months of his occasional visits to check on her and her younger brother Tommy, the sight of him still made her pulse quicken in ways she refused to acknowledge. Luke stood tall and lean, with dark hair that perpetually needed cutting and eyes the color of sage after rain. More troublesome still was the way he looked at her, not as the peculiar woman who insisted on wearing men's trousers and managing cattle, but as if she were something precious worth protecting. "Good morning to you too, Sheriff," Maggie replied, ejecting the spent cartridge with practiced ease. "What brings you out so early?" Luke's expression grew serious. "Cattle rustlers hit the Morrison place last night. Took 30 head and left old Morrison tied up in his own barn." He paused, studying her face. "I'm concerned they might target isolated ranches next." The O'Brien ranch sat in a remote valley, accessible only by a narrow canyon pass, strategically advantageous for defense, but leaving them vulnerable if caught unaware. Maggie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "How many men?" she asked, already calculating ammunition supplies and defensive positions. "At least 4, maybe more. Morrison said they knew exactly where to find his best stock." Luke stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Maggie, you and Tommy should consider staying in town until we catch them." "Absolutely not." The words came out sharper than she intended. "This land has been in my family for 15 years. I won't be driven off by common thieves." "There's nothing common about men who would bind an elderly rancher and leave him to die." Luke's jaw tightened. "These aren't opportunistic drifters, Maggie. They're organized, dangerous, and they won't hesitate to hurt anyone who gets in their way." The concern in his voice made her chest tighten. Since her father's death, she'd grown accustomed to standing alone, making every decision that kept their ranch solvent and her 17-year-old brother on the right path. Having someone worry about her welfare felt both foreign and achingly welcome. "Then I suppose it's fortunate I can defend what's mine," she said, patting the rifle stock. Luke removed his hat, running fingers through his hair in what she'd learned was a gesture of frustration. "Your marksmanship won't help if they overwhelm you with numbers or catch you sleeping." "What exactly are you suggesting, Sheriff?" "Let me station a deputy here. Or better yet, let me stay myself until this threat passes." The offer hung between them, loaded with implications neither seemed prepared to address directly. Maggie found herself studying his face, the strong line of his jaw, the small scar above his left eyebrow from some long-ago mishap, the way his mouth curved slightly when he was thinking. She'd noticed that mouth far too often lately. "The townspeople need their sheriff?" she said finally. "The townspeople have a capable deputy. And he took another step closer, close enough that she caught the scent of leather and soap that always seemed to surround him. "I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you because I was too much of a coward to speak plainly." "Speak plainly about what?" The question emerged barely above a whisper. Before Luke could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Tommy O'Brien rode into view, leading their neighbor's paint horse behind him. At 17, he'd grown tall like their father but still retained the gangly awkwardness of youth. His face was flushed with exertion and something that looked remarkably like panic. "Maggie. Sheriff," he called, sliding from his saddle. "Mrs. Patterson sent me to fetch you both. Someone broke into her smokehouse last night and made off with 3 months' worth of preserved meat." Luke and Maggie exchanged glances. The Patterson place lay just 5 miles southeast, close enough to be concerning. "Any sign of which direction they headed?" Luke asked. "Northeast toward the Badlands. Mrs. Patterson found hoofprints and," Tommy hesitated, glancing at his sister, "and some other things that spooked her considerable." "What sort of things?" Maggie demanded. "Empty whiskey bottles and remains of a campfire about a quarter-mile from her house. Like they'd been watching the place." The implications sent ice through Maggie's veins. Rustlers who scouted their targets and camped nearby were far more dangerous than opportunistic thieves. They were methodical, patient, and clearly unafraid of being discovered. "I'm riding with you to investigate," she told Luke. "Like hell you are," Luke replied automatically, then caught himself. Forgive my language, but this is exactly the kind of situation where you need to stay somewhere safe. Safe? Maggie's temper flared. You mean helpless? Hidden away while other people handle my problems. She shouldered her rifle and strode toward the barn. I've been managing this ranch and protecting my family just fine without masculine interference. Thank you very much. Damn it, Maggie, Luke followed her, his longer stride easily keeping pace. This isn't about your capability. It's about keeping you alive. She whirled to face him, eyes blazing. And what gives you the right to make that decision for me? You're not my husband, my father, or my guardian. You're barely even a friend. The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them. Luke's expression shifted from frustration to something much more vulnerable, and she realized how deeply she'd wounded him. You're right, he said quietly. I have no claim on you whatsoever. He settled his hat back on his head and touched the brim formally. Good day, Miss O'Brien. I'll be sure to inform you if we learn anything relevant to your safety. He mounted his horse and rode away without looking back, leaving Maggie standing in the barnyard feeling simultaneously vindicated and utterly wretched. Tommy appeared at her elbow, studying her with the uncomfortable perceptiveness that ran in their family. That was poorly done, sister. He had no right to dictate my actions, she said, but the words lacked conviction. Maybe not. But he's the only man I've ever seen look at you like you hung the moon and stars, and you just told him he means nothing to you. Maggie closed her eyes, remembering the hurt that had flashed across Luke's features. He'll recover. Men like Sheriff Garrison always do. What if you're wrong? What if he decides you're not worth the trouble? The question haunted her through the rest of the morning as she threw herself into ranch work, checking fence lines and tending to their small herd with unusual vigor. Tommy wisely stayed out of her way, understanding that his sister processed strong emotions through physical activity. By afternoon, word had spread through the valley that the rustlers had struck again, this time hitting the Kowalski farm and making off with their prize breeding bull. The pattern was becoming clear. They were systematically targeting the area's most valuable livestock, moving in an organized sweep that suggested intimate knowledge of local operations. Maggie was in the barn grooming her mare when she heard riders approaching. Her hand instinctively moved to the rifle propped against the stall door, but she relaxed when Tommy called out a greeting. She emerged to find her brother talking with Jake Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's eldest son. Evening, Miss O'Brien, Jake said, touching his hat. He was a nice enough young man, though his obvious romantic interest in her had always made their interactions somewhat awkward. Ma sent me to check on you and Tommy. She's worried about isolated homesteads. That's kind of her. Please tell your mother we're taking all necessary precautions. Jake dismounted, tying his horse to the rail with the easy confidence of someone comfortable around livestock. Actually, she was hoping you might consider staying at our place for a few days. We've got plenty of room, and with Pa and my brothers around, it'd be considerably safer. The offer was reasonable, even generous, but something in Jake's expression made Maggie wary. She'd grown skilled at recognizing when men viewed her current situation as an opportunity rather than genuine concern for her welfare. I appreciate the offer, but Tommy and I will be fine here. But Miss Maggie, Jake pressed, stepping closer, a woman alone with just a boy to protect her, it ain't natural or safe, especially not with dangerous men roaming the territory. I'm not alone, she replied coolly. I have my rifle, good defensive positions, and enough ammunition to discourage uninvited visitors. Jake's smile became patronizing in a way that set her teeth on edge. Now you know that's just foolish talk. These aren't the sort of men who'll be deterred by a woman with a gun, no matter how well she can shoot tin cans. Before Maggie could deliver the sharp retort forming on her tongue, another voice cut through the evening air. I wouldn't underestimate Miss O'Brien's defensive capabilities if I were you, Patterson. They turned to see Luke riding up the trail, his posture relaxed but his hand resting casually near his sidearm. Despite their earlier confrontation, Maggie felt a rush of relief at his presence. Sheriff, Jake said, his tone notably less friendly. Didn't expect to see you out here again so soon. Just making my rounds, ensuring all our citizens are properly protected. Luke's gaze found Maggie's, and she caught a glimmer of something that might have been an apology. Miss O'Brien, I wanted to inform you that we've had developments in the rustling investigation. What sort of developments? She asked. We caught one of them trying to sell stolen cattle in Millerville. Under questioning, he revealed they're planning to hit one more ranch before moving on, somewhere they believe will yield the highest value with the least resistance. The words hung heavy with implication. The O'Brien Ranch, while not the largest in the valley, was known for its quality bloodlines and isolated location. When? Maggie asked. Tonight, most likely. They'll want to move under cover of darkness. Jake stepped forward, his earlier diffidence replaced by aggressive concern. All the more reason for Miss O'Brien to accept safe shelter elsewhere. Or, Luke said mildly, we could ensure they meet with more resistance than anticipated. Maggie looked between the two men, recognizing the territorial tension crackling beneath their ostensibly helpful offers. Jake represented traditional expectations, the assumption that she needed masculine protection and should gratefully accept whatever terms were offered. Luke, conversely, seemed to understand that she was capable of partnership rather than merely requiring rescue. "What do you have in mind, Sheriff?" she asked. "A trap. We let them come but ensure they find more than they bargained for." Luke's eyes met hers directly. "If you're willing to trust me, despite our earlier misunderstanding." The apology in his voice was unmistakable, and Maggie felt her anger from that morning dissolve entirely. He was offering not just protection but partnership, acknowledging her right to defend her own property, while providing the backup she'd be foolish to refuse. "I'm listening," she said. Jake's face darkened. "This is madness. You're talking about using Miss O'Brien as bait." "I'm talking about giving her the chance to participate in defending what belongs to her," Luke replied evenly, "which, as I understand it, is what she's been asking for all along." The distinction was important, and Maggie felt something warm unfurl in her chest at Luke's understanding. He saw her as an ally rather than a liability, a partner rather than an obligation. "What would you need me to do?" she asked. Luke's smile was approving and somehow intimate despite their audience. "Exactly what you'd normally do. Tend your stock, maintain your routines, let them think you're unaware of the threat. Tommy should definitely stay in town tonight, no point in putting him at unnecessary risk." "Now hold on," Jake began. "This is my decision to make," Maggie interrupted firmly. "Tommy, saddle your horse. Mrs. Patterson has kindly offered you shelter tonight." Her brother looked as though he might protest, then caught something in her expression that made him nod reluctantly. "What about you?" "I'll be fine. Sheriff Garrison and I will handle this." Jake mounted his horse with obvious displeasure. "When this goes wrong, don't say you weren't offered better alternatives." After he and Tommy rode away, Maggie found herself alone with Luke for the first time since their argument. The silence stretched uncomfortably until she finally spoke. "I owe you an apology for this morning. What I said was cruel and untrue." Luke dismounted, loosening his horse's cinch. "You were protecting yourself. I can't fault you for that." "From what?" He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. "From me, from what I want from you." "And what do you want from me, Luke?" The use of his given name seemed to surprise them both. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to that low register she'd begun to associate with moments of unguarded honesty. "Everything," he said simply. "Your trust, your partnership, your affection. The right to worry about your safety and celebrate your victories. The privilege of standing beside you instead of watching from a respectful distance." Maggie's pulse quickened. "That's quite a list. Too ambitious?" She studied his face, noting the uncertainty he was trying to hide. This was Sheriff Luke Garrison, who faced down armed criminals and kept peace in a lawless territory, made vulnerable by her potential rejection. The knowledge was both thrilling and terrifying. "Ask me again after we've dealt with tonight's visitors," she said. "If we're both still alive, we can discuss your ambitions properly." His smile was answer enough. They spent the remaining daylight hours preparing. Luke positioned himself in the barn loft with a clear view of the approaches, while Maggie maintained her normal evening routine in the house. As darkness fell, she extinguished all but one lamp and settled near a window with her rifle, waiting. The attack came just after midnight. 4 men approached on foot, having left their horses in the canyon. Through the window, Maggie watched them spread out with military precision, 2 heading for the barn where her cattle were penned, 2 circling toward the house. She waited until they were committed to their positions, then fired a single shot over their heads, the agreed signal. Luke's rifle answered immediately from the barn, followed by shouts of surprise and anger from the would-be thieves. "This is Sheriff Garrison," Luke called out. "You're surrounded and outnumbered. Throw down your weapons and surrender." The response was a barrage of gunfire that shattered 2 windows and sent Maggie diving for cover behind her father's heavy oak desk. She could hear Luke returning fire from the loft, could see muzzle flashes in the darkness as the rustlers tried to locate his position. One of them had circled around toward the back of the house. Maggie heard boots on the porch steps and positioned herself beside the kitchen door, rifle ready. When the door crashed inward, she was waiting. "Drop it," she said quietly. The rustler spun toward her voice, his own weapon rising. But Maggie's shot took him in the shoulder before he could fire. He crashed backward through the doorway, his gun skittering across the porch boards. Outside, the gunfight continued for several more minutes before falling silent. Maggie waited, every sense alert, until she heard Luke calling her name. "Maggie, are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she called back. "One down in the kitchen." When Luke appeared in her doorway, she felt a relief so intense it left her shaky. He was disheveled, his shirt torn and his face streaked with dirt, but gloriously, reassuringly alive. "The others?" she asked. "2 captured, 1 escaped. We'll get him." He stepped over the groaning rustler to reach her, his hands framing her face as he searched for injuries. "You're certain you're unharmed?" "Completely." She leaned into his touch, suddenly aware of how precious this moment felt. "We did it, Luke. We protected what's mine." "Ours," he said softly. "If you'll have me." Looking into his eyes, Maggie realized that sometime during their shared danger, her feelings had crystallized into something unmistakable and undeniable. This man had offered her partnership instead of protection, respect instead of restriction. He'd seen her strengths instead of focusing on her vulnerabilities. "Ask me properly," she whispered. Luke's smile was radiant. "Magnolia O'Brien, would you do me the immense honor of becoming my wife? Will you let me stand beside you, work alongside you, and love you for whatever years God grants us?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes to all of it." When he kissed her, it was with the relief of a man who'd found something precious he'd been afraid to hope for. Maggie kissed him back with the joy of a woman who'd discovered that true partnership didn't diminish her independence, it enhanced it. Later, after the rustlers had been taken to town and statements given, they sat on her porch watching the stars emerge in the clear night sky. Luke's arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest, both of them finally at peace. "I have a confession," Luke said into the comfortable silence. "Only one?" She felt his chuckle rumble through his chest. "I've been in love with you since the first time I saw you out riding 3 of your own cowhands to bring in a stubborn steer. That was 8 months ago." 8 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days, he confirmed. But who's counting? Maggie smiled, thinking of all the careful dances they'd performed around their mutual attraction, all the proper distances maintained, despite their obvious compatibility. "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" "Because I wanted to be certain I could offer you what you needed, not just what convention demanded. You're not a woman who'll be satisfied with a husband who sees you as decorative rather than essential." She tilted her head to look at him, struck by his understanding. "And you're prepared for a wife who wears trousers and carries a rifle." "I'm prepared for a wife who's brave enough to fight for what she believes in and generous enough to let me fight alongside her." His lips brushed her temple. "Besides, have you seen how you look in those trousers? It's positively distracting." Maggie laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet valley. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, rebuilding what had been damaged, planning a wedding, figuring out how to merge their lives practically and legally. But tonight, sitting in the arms of the man who loved her exactly as she was, she felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's death, the deep security of knowing she wasn't alone anymore. "I love you too," she said into the star-filled darkness, in case that wasn't sufficiently clear. Luke's arms tightened around her. "Clear as mountain spring water, darling, clear as day." And in the peaceful silence that followed, with the dangers past and the future spreading before them like an uncharted territory waiting to be explored together, Maggie O'Brien knew she'd found something worth more than all the cattle in 3 counties. A love worth defending, a partnership worth fighting for, and a man who saw her not as someone to be protected, but as someone to stand with against whatever challenges life might bring. The western wind whispered through the valley, carrying with it the promise of new adventures and the certainty that they would face them together, as equals, as partners, as the family they were choosing to become.